Alrighty, everybody, welcome in. Oops, we actually one moment. We have a technical difficulty with the capture here. I promise you that Sam Peterson is actually here. He is here, but Sam, you're invisible at the
Hey
moment.
everybody.
One second. You guys can probably hear him. This is fabulous. We're off to a fabulous start. I'm gonna pop us over here. We'll
Hello.
pop over here where you can see our both our faces in our screen captures. My name is Voodoo Val, and I am a professional streamer. I do this for a living. I'm going to be hanging out with Sam Peterson today for another episode of CreaTips, and I'm super excited to welcome him here. Sam, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on, Val. I'm excited to be here and talk about some materials.
Yeah, it's going to be a pretty good episode. So, all of you folks out there who are illustrators or folks who kind of dabble in some other realms of creativity, but find yourselves doing concepts similar to some of the stuff we're going to be diving in today, this is an episode dedicated to rendering different materials, talking about the approach to certain things like metal, different kinds of fabric, skin, and maybe some magical types of things which I'm super pumped about. So yeah, Cody in the chat saying professional. It happens, okay? We're live, things happen. But it is good to see all of you folks. I see Christopher over in the YouTube chat. It is great to see you. Jack Watson is in the house, Oliver, Umacorn, Cody, as I mentioned. I see Jeff. Yes, I love your name, Jeff. That is a perfect name. We got Clever Devlin, Joshua in the house, some guy named Sam. I don't know who that is, but
Get him out of here.
yeah, get him a band. But yeah, I figure we just kind of jump right into it and kind of talk about the first material we'll be diving into for the day, which is going to be a little bit of metal. And I'm super
Yes.
pumped.
Metal is my go-to all
Hmm
the time.
I think that you have developed a very distinctive style for your metal, and I have many a time actually pulled up some of your stuff to kind of dissect your technique when it comes to illustrating metal. So I'm super excited to see how you approach it. I myself, I have like a ring here, which I figure we can kind of do like a burnished gold ring for me, and it looks like you've got some armor here.
Yeah, I thought it'd be fun to kind of set up a practical application of how I might use all these things. So I do a ton of character work, fantasy character work.
Hmm
So figured a pauldron is a good one to show off metal. We got like a pouch and a belt for leather, a face for skin, just like the most common applications for all these materials for me.
Yeah. I think that I also we're going like a little fantasy realm for me as well because that is my typical go-to. I think that we are kind of on the same wavelength when it comes to choosing types of things to do. We always really have been. And so I've got like this will probably end up being a kind of ring of power, really. And we've got the inside of the ring showing on my base illustration here. So if anybody would like to tell us what is going to be engraved on the inside of this ring, definitely let us know. But as you deliberate, I personally, my personal preference for Ring of Power engraving is that the elves who made it are snarky. So do with that what you will, chat. But I'm just going to start like kind of throwing in some values. And I don't know about you, Sam, but whenever I approach any kind of material like this, I typically do like kind of a like base values to give it 3D form before I start really insinuating or suggesting that it is a particular kind of substance or whatever it is I'm going for. How do you typically approach that?
Yeah, so I'll give you guys a little overview of what I'm doing here. You might see that I already have some layers done. So what I did was I started with a line drawing. I cleaned it up a little bit just to define where the edges are. I did a mask here, and then I did an ambient occlusion layer on top of the mask, which is just these shadows, essentially all the little nooks and crannies, the recessed areas where light can't bounce into. That's where you get your deepest darks.
Mm-hmm.
So I did that with an ambient occlusion layer, and then I put on a flat color layer. So
Mm-hmm.
all this I'm clipping to my mask. And the flat color layer is just the local color. You can add a little bit of texture, like you might see that I'm doing a little bit of brush variation to show texture.
Yeah.
Then I do a shadow layer, which is a multiply layer, and I
Hmm.
do a light layer, which is color dodge layer. And basically, I'm just trying to lay out my preliminary forms before I really get into it, because I think there's two things that I think of when I think of texture, or sorry, that I think of when I think of materials. It's specularity and then surface texture.
Hmm.
So specularity is basically just how shiny something is, how much it reflects light. You're going to have that very different through metal, leather, cloth, skin. And then the actual surface texture is like the what you usually think of when you think of texture, something you lay down like a photo texture that
Yeah.
just has the variations within the object. And I think those two things are what really communicates materials for me. So I'm just setting up the lighting, and then we'll go into kind of with these preliminary lighting layers. I'll try to get the specularity kind of right, and then we'll really go into making this thing shiny and giving it a bit of surface texture too.
I think that's really awesome to hear because I think there's a lot of approaches to go through for something like this, but you have like a very technical approach to this particular kind of material. And I did show your full screen there, and we're back on the dual screen here, so just we can get like kind of the difference in the styles that Sam and I are doing. I kind of like to, as odd as it is, I render everything out like the same. Like it's all just basic values with no, sometimes I use a texture brush. Like right now, I actually think we were using the same brush for a second there. It's like
Mm-hmm.
a textury chalky brush that has kind of like little wisps and shapes kind of pulling off the edge of it, which I've seen you use before, and we've kind of acquired some of the same texture brushes over the years.
Yeah.
But yeah, I use like a chalky brush and just like make it look like a 3D object, and then I will come in and start to suggest like my different uh, like a variation of substance with the blending modes, similar to how you suggest it. And it's kind of, I feel like a lot of my metal materials, at least just with the way that I approach it, typically it doesn't look a lot like metal until I start like messing with the blending modes and adding those shine points and all of that stuff as I get going. And I would love to know if there's anybody in chat who does illustrations similar to this, if you guys are digital painters or illustrators, or if you guys, because I feel like there's an element of graphic design in a way to this, depending on how you approach it, because there's large forms and shapes that you could be kind of placing down as like a graphic vector type piece too, where you'd be applying some of the same techniques. And I'd be curious to know what you folks in chat do. I'm kind of adding like a dark rim to this in a way, to kind of suggest a little bit more form as far as like the roundness of this. I've got a pretty harsh lip on the edge of my ring, and everything is very not very clean, you know. But I kind of
Mm-hmm.
just start to push the boundary of that form a little bit as it comes to fruition, so to speak. But you also do like line art uh, underneath your
Yeah.
piece too.
Yeah, I do the line art first. I think it's really helpful to identify for me where the edges of objects are, because I
Mm-hmm.
find if I'm just painting directly, I spend so much time trying to define what the shape is that I prefer to just do that, the construction, the perspective, the actual shape. I prefer to just do that in the line art phase initially, and then I can just focus completely on lighting the object. And just to clarify for people watching, I think two things that I have in mind when I'm doing this are the light direction.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to have a very defined light direction before you start. Otherwise, there's going to be a lot of pushing and pulling and changing things.
Hmm.
And just to clarify my technique a little bit here, you might see that I'm using an opaque round brush and then smudging it. So I like to put in my lights, kind of determine, okay, this is the point facing the light source the most. That's the specular highlight. And then maybe here's like a bounce light coming from the edge. You can see that little, this sort of bounce light that I have on the edge of it coming from like the sky or just what's behind them.
Yeah.
And then I go in with a smudge tool and I just soften those up really quickly just to kind of block in my light. So I do it really chunky. I block them in, smudge them a little bit, adjust it, smudge that a little bit. And it's kind of this um, definitive process where I'm really trying to define, okay, this is where it is, but I can also have a lot of adjusting that I can do. And
Yeah.
just so everyone knows, my smudge tool is a soft round brush, and the strength at the top is set to 50%. And if you go into the brush settings, scattering is checked on and it's set to 10%. So that's kind of what I'm using. The more scattering you do, the more system intensive it's going to be. And also, I have spacing set to 25. So the lower spacing you have, the more intensive it's going to be. So just something to keep in mind. I use my smudge tool in a pretty small space.
Yeah, that's one thing I actually remember years ago kind of watching how you used the smudge brush specifically, which I always thought was really, really helpful. And it is good that you point out the system intensity that you can get, because the smudge brush does get a little, depending on what system you're using, like what your specs are, it can kind of it might chug a little bit. I definitely, when I think it was like 2016 when you were like, hey, use the smudge brush, and I was like, I don't know. I because I cranked those settings up, but I think that you folks at home, if you would like to use this approach, um, definitely check it out and maybe start with Sam's settings and then kind of find a happy medium for you. It definitely took me a little bit of experimenting to get it right and really jump on uh, kind of what was perfect for me. But the
Mhm.
smudge brush is a very, very useful tool that you can use to get those forms for a lot of different materials too, though, because I like to use the smudge brush specifically when I'm painting skin. But I think that you can still, depending on what you're smudging, like if you're smudging a textured brush, it kind of gives you a little bit different texture than if you were, for example, smudging some kind of soft round, maybe, and you can really kind of get a nice variation of different textures and stuff as you go along.
Yeah,
Um,
I like to use the smudge brush for a lot of my initial forming out. And you can see here, if you guys look at my screen, I'm going into a painting layer. Usually I like to set up my preliminary lighting direction
mhm,
with those base layers of like multiply, color dodge. But when I'm just painting, you can see how I'm just making these chunky brush strokes to block them in. And then I go in with the smudge tool
mhm,
and I just kind of soften up the edges I want to be soft. I'm reinforcing this core shadow, which is essentially the darkest place in the object where neither light source is really hitting. We have a reflected light source and we have the main light source. So it's kind of the dark spot between the two.
yeah.
And I just sort of block in all these. And then if they look good, I'll soften them up a bit and I'll color pick from that and keep going. So this is kind of the method I use for all of that.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. I think that what I'm gonna do is start adding a little bit of like blending mode color to mine, just to kind of pull it out of the gray zone. And I do like I'm definitely seeing like a lot of things from your particular technique that I could be adding into my approach, because like you really get that form down very quickly. And I do kind of like what you were saying, like you said that you do a lot of the line art at first so that you can really define that edge and you're not like playing with the boundaries of the item itself. And I'm finding, like, just listening to you say that, I'm like noticing in my own process here where I could probably be a lot more accurate and finish what I'm attempting quicker if I were to employ that particular technique, because I do kind of just go straight into like painting the form rather than doing a few lines, and it definitely is a more experimental process and like chipping away and trimming those edges than yours. And I actually think that it would probably be better if I employed some of your techniques. So I'm definitely learning as well when it comes to the stream, which feels really cool. I'm gonna go ahead and use a blending mode, and I use clipping masks. Are you a clipping mask guy?
Absolutely, all the time.
Clipping masks are probably like one of my most favorite things ever. I think they've
Yeah,
saved my life a billion times.
it just speeds up the process so much. Like like I said, with the kind of definitive line drawing, once I have that down, I'll just make a mask and I know where all my edges are, so I can just clip it and kind of focus on painting,
Yeah, yeah.
not have to worry about the edges or anything like that.
I also like to, as I come in and add color, I also like to like use a few different uh like hues and tones, and I think that I
Mm,
like doing that because when you look at like metal, you might be painting gold, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the item that you're using is going to look gold all the way through. Like there are reflections and like outside information that makes up the colors of something that is like a shining metal piece. You're going to get a lot of like what's around, what's in that scene. You're going to get
yeah.
like greens from foliage. If somebody's wearing like shining metal armor outside, you're probably going to get a lot of bursts of white tones and things if somebody is, you know, under an open sky with like, you know, shades of blue and all that kind of stuff. So I personally like to start like coming in and jotting in some random variations on the gold colors and gold tones themselves, and then throwing in a lot of like other um, not random tones, but you know, like I'll come in with a little bit of green and I'll come in with a little bit of blue and just add something other to the form.
Yeah, you can't see it in this piece because there's no other rendered things, and I don't typically work like this. I work everything up at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of times on this reflected light, you'll see I'll put kind of a bluish tone because, if they're outside, it's going to be reflecting the sky a bit. If they
Yeah.
have like a leather vest, you might see a bit of brown being reflected into the metal because of that. So I definitely color pick from the colors around that object
Mm-hmm.
and kind of think like, where would this reflect? Just even if it's a little bit, even if it's just a touch of it.
Yeah. 100%. And it is, as you say, it is a little bit easier when you have other stuff kind of happening in the zone. Um, but I think a really great kind of way to find reference if you're painting certain stuff is I actually like to like Google images of spoons,
Okay.
like silverware, and there's
Yeah.
obviously you could, you know, look up images of like actual armor and things, but I feel like googling trying to find like real life like everyday kind of examples of certain kinds of metals is kind of the way to go sometimes. And I feel like a spoon, I often you know, it's like a rounded object, and people, depending on where the photo is taken of it, it's like can be used in reference to perhaps a breastplate that has like a big bow of metal in the chest and stuff like that. So I'll do stuff like that. Or yo, what's up, Wade? Wade's in the chat, and Jerry.
Hey, what's going on, Wade and Jerry?
Good to see you guys. But yeah, like, you know, like real world applications or real world, I guess, metal in the wild, you might
Yeah,
say.
for sure. And I think I actually have an image I can show.
Yeah.
This is something I made up just for this stream, but this is a good example of if you're doing a piece, it's good to get reference, or if you're just trying to study materials, it's good to do something like this where, what does leather look like? What makes leather look the way it does?
Mm-hmm.
One key thing I've always noted about leather and I like painting is sometimes you'll have this really warm color of orange, like an orangish red,
Mm-hmm.
but the highlights will be cool. They almost look kind of blue in comparison.
Yeah.
And that's a really interesting thing about leather that makes it kind of unique along with the surface texture and everything. So having a reference and actually noting these things, like you said with spoons, and kind of understanding why does it look the way it does. Oh, it's because this thing's rounded and it's reflecting this surface.
Mm-hmm.
It helps a lot. And with metal, I have these like metal spheres that I have pictures of, and you can kind of see the more shiny it gets, the more it just essentially becomes a mirror.
Yeah.
But then when you have a little bit dulled, you can still see how those same things are reflected. Like, oh, there's a blue light in the top left of this rough metal.
Mm-hmm.
But you could tell if that was polished a little bit more, you'd get a lot more clarity on like, oh, that's the sky or it's this object to the left of the room. So having these references where you can look at it and kind of deduce like why does it look the way it does and where is this reflection coming from
Mm-hmm.
helps a lot when you're when you have to do it yourself.
Yeah, I agree. That's a really good point. And just honestly, I think when it comes to approaching any kind of, because in a way it's like a study, in a
Hmm.
way, because you're trying to mimic something, especially when you're trying to mimic something that's very real in a fantasy setting, which you and I often are. Having a mood board in general, of like a little bit of fantasy but also a little bit of real life, is a great way to go.
Definitely. How long do we have on metal, by the way? Are we
We can
moving to
switch. We
leather?
can flip over to some fabric if you want. I think we're probably coming to the end of it a little bit here. I personally, I would love, like, you got this metal in like so quick, and I'm so impressed with this. And I'm realizing, like I said earlier, like just how long it actually takes me to paint metal. So I'm gonna have to review this and check out your process and do a little test. Maybe I'll tag you in it.
Well, it's also tricky because this is kind of like the rendered stage where you make something look real, where you make it look like that material.
Hmm.
So doing that quick can be pretty tricky for sure.
Yeah, let's and I think you're gonna be doing for fabric and stuff, you're gonna be doing a little bit of leather. And I'm gonna
Yeah,
be doing some sheer fabric, which I think is gonna be super fun. Let's see. All the
very
hall
cool.
monitors. Yes, all the hall monitors are in the chat right now. I think it's fine if we have hall monitors in the chat though, because all the hall monitors happen to be like some of the biggest fantasy nerds we know here on Adobe Live. So all hall monitors welcome. I also
Yeah,
see that Jennifer Poole jumped in, so it's good to see you, Jennifer. I am going to go ahead and collapse my metal uh, group here, and I'm going to come over to my shear. And if you don't mind, real quick, I'm going to pop over to my screen, because I would love to kind of show how I approach this particularly, because this is a workflow that used to really scare me when it came to like painting something like this, and I've kind of figured out a really good approach to sheer fabric. So I'm going to pop in here to my layers and take a closer look real quick. So if I go ahead and hide this, I did myself like a little sketch kind of like the basic vibe that I wanted to go for this. But typically, what I do when approaching fabric that you can see through, like tulle or some kind of lace or something, I like to sketch in a shape, which I've done here, which is just kind of a triangle shape, honestly, because I know that I want it to fall in this way. And then I do a little bit of squiggling down at the bottom, because when you go to approach like transparent fabric, it can kind of feel really weird if you're trying to do all the different elements of this sort of form at once. But I come in with a little bit of squiggling like this. And it's literally just, if I grab myself a red brush here so we can do like another version of this, I literally just come in and I'm like, okay, following the bottom of that shape, like, can we do like a little bit of that, right? And that kind of looks like the falling of fabric, like the ends of very loose, very lightweight fabric, and then just kind of drawing lines up from the very ends of those squiggles. And we can turn this a little bit on a lower opacity just so we can really see. What I've done is I've come in from these little squiggly bits, and I will say, okay, well, this one here, let's actually go back to red so we can really see this. This little area here is one of the ends. And if this is transparent, meaning we're going to see all the layers of this, then there's definitely going to be a crease there up to our corner. There's also going to be a crease here because this is another one. Note that there's all these little points here where this fabric is going to be folding into itself. So there's another crease that needs to come up here, and same with here and here. And as you start to build like this kind of overlapping shape where these portions of the fabric folds over, it starts to make a little more sense, at least in my brain. Like, okay, I'm not just going to be painting the fabric in an opaque manner, and it doesn't have to be overwhelming to know exactly where those fabric folds will be underneath each other. And as I have all of these things lined out, what I do is come in with a lasso tool, which I'm just gonna show only our little piece right here, just our line out, our liner, I come in with a lasso tool and I start to make certain portions of it darker or lighter. So I will come in and we can just select our shape here so that the whole of the shape will have a color to it. So I will just kind of go ahead and like paint bucket that in with a gray. And then you can kind of pick and choose where those overlapping areas are. So this right here, this is an overlapping area. So we can come and select that and make that a little bit darker. And then we can kind of do that systematically until they all sort of overlap with each other. And I'll pop back over here to the dual screen so that we can see both of our workspaces, and I'll chip away on this, and maybe you, Sam, can like talk about how you do your leather.
Yeah, definitely. So let me show you what I've done in the past few minutes. Basically, I put my preliminary lighting layers. So this is the ambient occlusion, which is just those cracks and crevices. Then I just darkened it down with the multiply because I like to paint in my my lighting with
Mm-hmm.
a color dodge layer. And then from here, it's just about understanding that material. So again, we're talking about leather this time. A lot of times what you'll see with old leather is the chipped off pieces, the cracked pieces are like a more saturated orange. And I think that's the color of the raw leather. There's like some treatment that they do with leather. I think that results in this kind of darker coating. But
Mm-hmm.
when that's cracked away, a lot of times you'll see the underneath parts. So I like to add those for the worn leather look. Typically,
Nice.
when I paint anything costume wise, I like to make it look worn because if I'm painting fantasy characters, they've gone on adventures, presumably. You know, if it's a character who's never been out and maybe they just got their gear, you'd want to reflect that in how nice their gear is. But
Yeah.
for me, it's usually battle hardened characters or characters who have been out and about a lot. So I like to do that, but you'll also notice some really cool color variation in leather, like kind of where it folds and cracks. You see some of that, but that coating that they put on it, whatever treatment it is, it's almost like it fluctuates in some areas. You see it darker in some and lighter in some areas. So
Mm-hmm.
I like to vary that color as well. This bag is a really good example. All these little scratches and nicks. Um, I think that's a really cool material. So for belt, you oftentimes see it on the edges here. That's why I'm kind of going brighter and orange. And I'll just put those around. Again, I'm doing it with the hard round brush. I like to block things out. I talked about the highlight before being a bit cooler. So you can see I put this cooler tone up here on the highlighted area. And really what I did for that was I just selected the local color of that area.
Mm-hmm.
I went into my color picker and I made it a little bit brighter and a little bit less saturated. So whenever I do that, if I'm going to make a cool highlight, I don't just pick blue arbitrarily. I'll color pick that object in the brightest point and then I'll adjust it a little bit from there.
Okay.
So I kind of have like, even if it's not super cool, it's cool compared to the color that you just picked it from because you cooled it down and
Yeah.
made it a little bit brighter. And then from here, I can go in and just block out any areas I think I want to communicate. Like this one is a little highlight. I think there would be on the pouch here, and I'll just smudge these and see how it looks, and then I'll adjust it and fix any colors that don't look right and go from there. So I blocked them
Nice.
all out, and now we'll smudge.
Yeah, that looks really, really great. And I think that just the way that you think of the lighting and stuff, it's already put so much like realism and detail in there, and like really what you've done is you smudged some colors around on it, but you've done it in precisely the right way that it reads in my brain as exactly what you intend it to be, and I think that's just amazing. I'm going to pop over here to our dual stream because I've placed in some of these values here. And what I actually did was I started paint bucketing earlier, just some of the values, and then what I actually changed it so that all of these layers of value are actually 100% black, and I've just changed the opacity a little bit so that you can actually see through them. So if I wanted to, incorporate this into some kind of piece where I do have something behind it, you would be able to see that, and it would function like, like sheer fabric as you start to add other things behind it or on top of it or however it is that you're going to be applying that. And I do have some pretty chunky lines in the the form here, but I honestly would probably come in and select like a soft round brush, or a hard round pressure opacity and flow, which has been a favorite of mine, and just kind of soften some of those edges, honestly, and kind of build this into a more dainty, I guess you might say, more dainty looking bit of fabric rather than hard lines and illustrative shapes. Um, and you can even, I think, something that I like to do, and in fact, as I paint it, maybe I can show an example of something that I have done previously, which I kind of applied this a lot. I'll pop up over here. Let me snag this. I've done this over the top of like skin and things like that in the past, and I think that it looks actually pretty good after you start to detail it. So I'll pull up kind of an example I have. It's an older painting of mine, which I feel like people might be sick of me showing it off. But you know, sometimes this is a piece that I did where I used the exact same approach, but very faintly over the top of the character's eyes here. And I actually applied like a pattern. So I just kind of took like this interesting mandala stamp brush and sectioned it out, like cut it into the same shapes as those little areas of our fabric, like I've illustrated here, and moved them around so it looked like they were folding with the fabric. And as you spend a little time on it, approaching it in that way, I think that you can start to create some really realistic kind of sheer texture. The sheer veil is so cool. Thank you, thank you. It's one of my favorites, honestly, and it's I think I started doing like more of the sheer texture and sheer fabric back then because I was like, I want to put a veil over this person, but like, you ever get into that mode where you're like, I want to do this thing artistically, but like,
Yeah, that's a tricky one.
how would I make it? How could I make it? Um, so that's where that began.
I think that's one of the more intimidating thing. Anything with like transparency can be tricky, but
Hmm.
something sheer like that, there's just so much going on because you have to communicate light form, but also what's behind it.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a tricky one.
And I think one of the harder things is like the differentiation of color depending on, because I got away with it, I think too, because a lot of the sheer fabric I paint is typically dark fabric. But like if you have like a super colorful like tulle kind of fabric going on, then that color is going to alter the colors of any objects behind it in a more exponential way than putting like darker values over the top of it under black.
Yeah.
Which so it gets, for me it gets a little tedious sometimes, like figuring that out. But I find that I have a much easier time of it if I approach actually getting over like the form and everything in this manner. Because then I'm worried less about like actually making it look like fabric, and the brunt of the work then becomes settling on colors and things like that. Gets a lot of that
Yeah.
stress out of the way.
And one thing I think is important to note for all these materials is materials and textures is kind of an advanced topic. If you are having trouble just getting the value range correct, you're going to have a lot of difficulty getting the texture to show through properly. Because I've talked about specularity for these materials,
Mm-hmm.
but if you don't even have the right value range, like dark enough darks and light enough lights to match what that object would be, you
Mm-hmm.
need those in place initially, and that's a hard enough thing on its own as value ranges. But just keep in mind if anyone's doing this kind of thing and they feel like it's kind of difficult, um, you want to make sure your values are in place first, and that's kind of the first step before you really get into the more textured area.
I think that's a great point. Um, I'm just coming in with some like smaller details here and like really kind of giving it a personality of its own. In a way, I think one of the most satisfying portions of illustrating transparent fabric is depending on how magical you want to be with your piece, I personally like to add like kind of a shimmery vibe to it, you know? So like on some of the areas where light hits it, kind of add like a differentiation in color. Like there's a little, you know, magical shimmer of sorts, you know, where that light hits it. And
Hmm.
technically, or actually, usually in application, what I like to do is, because I paint so much in black and white, I actually like to do like a gradient map after I have the form in and experiment with the kinds of like shimmers and colors that could be applied to like my lightest values in that regard, because it actually ends up being super, super fun to experiment in that way. Do you use a lot of gradient maps?
I don't, just for basically magic and
Mm,
something we'll be talking about in a bit, but not in the my usual process outside of that.
nice, nice. I think if you have your gradient maps worked out pretty well, they can be very useful. But it is something that I too, honestly, like if I'm adding a magical shimmer to something, then I think that it's super fun to do. But you can mess up your realism a lot with gradient maps if you go a little hog wild. So
Yeah.
probably best to do it oneself unless you're adding a little bit of witchiness to whatever you're working on. But maybe we can do, because we've got a couple other materials that we wanted
Yeah.
to touch on for today, and we've got about 20 minutes left. So I think that
Okay.
we can, yeah, kind of move along. The
Sounds
next
good.
one was going to be like a skin texture.
Yeah.
Um, so what is your why don't you explain your process and your approach to that, Sam?
So whenever I'm going over these, I'm having a hard time pulling myself away from the leather. All right,
Yeah,
we're
you're like,
good.
no, I could just add this one last thing.
Just one more brush stroke.
Yeah.
Um, when I'm going for skin or any material, I always try to analyze like what makes this, what specularity am I trying to hit? And this
Hmm.
is for me, I've always really enjoyed um the lighting, the rendering, trying to make something look 3D.
Hmm.
So what I've kind of concluded with skin tones, at least for me, is that it almost seems like slightly oily clay. Like if
Yeah.
you've ever rendered clay, it's very uniform and predictable, but it's just like that, but like oil-based clay or slightly like moist clay, where you
Hmm.
have a little bit of these highlights and specularities kind of creeping in.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I think that like one of my favorite parts of, because I have like I've just decided to do like a textured skin sphere here. Um,
Hmm.
but I think one of my favorite things is like a differentiation of texture after I have that form in. So I've got, you know, like a just a general sphere that is it looks like it is sort of 3D, but adding a little bit of those like highlights around the edges, and starting to add in that color to show like a blood under the skin, and
Yeah.
that differentiation underneath that, as you say, like a oily clay kind of feel, is one of my favorite parts.
Yeah, and I think what you said about the color is really important too, because specifically with skin, when I see people having trouble or when I see skin that looks kind of odd, it's usually that the hues and the saturation aren't really where they should be.
Hmm.
I think is a lot of that effect of the blood underneath the skin. So if you're going too desaturated, you can sometimes find yourself looking like the skin looks muddy or just doesn't look alive.
Yeah.
And for me, when I'm going in with my shadows right now, I'm actually purposely cranking the saturation up more and going more within the red range. So I use multiply for my shadows, but I had to go a little bit more saturated, a little bit more pink. Otherwise, it looks wrong. So that's
Yeah.
definitely something to consider.
I think one of the things that I see people struggle with when it comes to painting skin, as you say, like just, you know, when things start to look a little muddy. But I think that a lot of those reasons for that is like approaching the painting of skin as if you are painting something, painting a material, the color that that skin is technically supposed to be, and not thinking about like, that blood under the skin, but also like what color does like blood look like through different colors? Like what does it look like through, like if you're doing an alien, what does it look like through blue? What does it look
Mhm.
like through a darker skin tone, and all those things, and using I one thing I used to do all the time is I used to use the same like color of um, like a reddish hue to insinuate blood under the skin of all different kinds of skin tones, and it just doesn't work that way. And I was like, why is it so muddy? Why is it
Uh-huh.
not working? And then, like for example, illustrating portions of the skin where you might actually need to add a little bit of blue tones, because there could be, if this person that you're illustrating grows facial hair, what does hair follicles under the skin translate to? And that's like sometimes a bluish hue or a greenish tint, depending on what color that person's hair is, and like seeing those sorts of shades along the jawline as well. um,
Yeah, there's a blog post you guys can look up in chat if you Google color zones the face James Gurney. He has a
mm,
little blog post on that, and yeah, it's kind of what you were saying. Like a lot of times, this chin area has a little more blue. Sometimes the nose, cheek, middle of the face area has a little bit more red because of the blood under the skin,
mhm,
and sometimes the head gets a little bit more yellow. And
mhm.
you can go really overt with it. He shows some examples like that, but you can also just take that information and be super subtle with it if you want to.
Yeah. I believe the forehead is like kind of a yellow tone because there's, a lot of bone close to the skin under is
Hmm.
where, people typically would have a tone closer to that. I think that there is, when it comes to an element of fantasy though, right? Like you kind of have to use a little bit of real life, and then also insinuate a lot of possibility too, because like I don't know about you, but I don't see people with green skin and scales walking around. So it's like, how do you insinuate blood under the skin of a lizard person or a merman, or so it does take a little bit of finessing to
Yeah.
insinuate that fantasy, but I think still that you can apply a lot of uh, that realism to it, as long as you maybe sometimes the difference is having a great understanding of color, and how colors work well together to kind of get that fantasy vibe.
Mhm. Yeah. I think a lot of times you kind of take what you learn about painting human face, and you can kind of see like, oh, there's color variations in these areas. So even if you're painting like an orc or a goblin or something that has green skin,
Mm-hmm.
you could try putting a little bit more like orange or warmth in the nose and see what
Mm-hmm.
happens. And sometimes you just find those colors. I mean, you can even go the opposite and go like, if it has a green nose, you could go more, maybe more towards blue towards the tip, and like, oh, that looks kind of cool. And, just experiment around with different tones and how they change the appearance.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that another really satisfying part, like, because after you kind of get that skin texture in, there's a lot of other things that makes skin very unique from other materials. And I think that a very satisfying element to illustrating it is adding certain things like moles, and
Hmm.
um, I think that for a good chunk of years, every single character that I ever painted had like clear skin, you know, like like
Yeah.
perfect smooth skin. Like she's a warrior and she's been battling in the swamp for eons, but no marks, no moles.
That's swamp air, it's
Yeah,
great for the pores.
so like getting in there and adding a little bit of personality, with blemishes or scarring or things like that is a really good idea. And I'm kind of gonna do that right now. I'm just like skin texturing this this sphere, and I'm gonna start adding like some scars and freckles to it. And I'm trying to keep an eye on time because I know that we are coming to the end. We kind of jam packed this really with
Yeah, yeah.
a lot of stuff. for
Well,
today. We've got some folks in chat though, saying Joshua was talking about things that have helped him understand materials, learning the concept that everything has a Fresnel effect. Girl got some great skin. Need her cleansing routine. Yes, the Swamp Witch always has, always has perfectly clear skin. Don't you know? Um, let's see. Sarush is saying that they love this, so I am excited that you are enjoying the show. And I hope that if you guys, honestly, if you guys are working on some things that require the illustration of specific textures and stuff, if you guys do any tests or kind of practice along or working along with us today, let us know what you're working on.
yeah, and I was gonna mention that you're doing a sphere, and I think that's a good way to approach this because I was starting to paint around the features of the face. And I don't know why I have to learn this lesson so many times, but I have to catch myself and I'm like, Sam, you're kind of painting it in the way that doesn't make as, much sense to you. I like to just paint the whole face, ignore all the features on it and paint it as a blob and then work in the
Ooh.
primitive shape,
Mm-hmm.
like with your sphere to get that overall feel. So I kind of redid, how I was approaching this and painting over these features, but I'm trying to focus on like where would those little specular highlights be
Yeah.
and how soft is everything. So for me with skin, it's a lot of softness. I think it's easy to go too blurry with everything, but having that mix of hard and soft edges, but having the like if you're painting a six pack, for example, a lot of people think, oh, it's chiseled, hard lines. But if you look at the gradation between values on like a real photo of a six pack, it's actually still pretty soft.
Mm-hmm.
So it's capturing that softness and then occasionally like here in the head, I'm putting a little bit of a harder edge. But those highlights too, I'm big on not going crazy on highlights for skin.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times people get really carried away with like all the shiny, like the dot on the nose, the
Mm-hmm.
specular highlight on the nose, and they want to make every part like the forehead's going to have this big shine, the noses, the lip. But I try to be subtle with it, so hopefully that comes across in how I'm painting this. But I'll make a highlight, I'll decide where that specular highlight would be, and then I'll soften it up just a bit. And that's kind of my trick with skin is getting the right amount of softness, and hard edges too, where they're appropriate, but not going too crazy on the highlights.
Gotcha, gotcha. And I apologize. I think that I clicked on the Zoom window, and so for a small moment there, I think that it said your Zoom title over the top, but your stuff is showing now. I don't know if you noticed that.
Okay.
Hopefully that wasn't too long, Cody. I apologize. This is I have three monitors up capturing all of our magic, and sometimes it gets uh, a little cluttered on the monitor there. Um, but I'm adding like a mole to my skin here. And I think something that I did not really do in the beginning when I was adding moles is I used to grab like a hard round brush, like a hard round pressure brush, and I used to grab like a straight black and then just like start putting like little dots on things. And some people have pretty dark moles. But I think that honestly, when it comes to illustrating moles, the better thing to do really is to use a dark color that is related to the skin tone. Something that is like more of a maybe a dark brown, or a dark tan color, sometimes even like a dark color that is more related to like a red or something. Looks very mole-esque against the skin, and it doesn't actually have to be so harsh. And I think that that was like some of the lessons that I learned early on, is that whenever I wanted to do something that was special for skin, I was very, very harsh with a lot of the things that I chose to add. Like you were saying, like that dot of light on the nose is a favorite of mine, and I think every character I painted for about 4 straight years looked like they had like fairy dew on their face, like something magical and shiny, when really I was just trying to convey a light spot, but I went a little overboard. It's very easy to do, especially when it's your favorite part of the face.
Yeah, I think everyone loves putting that highlight down.
Yeah. Folks in chat have decided that lizard people do love dewy foundation. And we are coming
Okay.
up to like 5 minutes here. Gosh, time is
Oh,
going
wow.
crazy. Yeah, we were gonna do a little bit of magic, but maybe we can if you would like to switch to just a tiny bit of magic before we take off for the day. I think we could do something interesting here before we take off.
Yeah, I can have some fairly brief thoughts on it.
Yeah, because you got, I noticed that you had like a pretty excellent form going. So maybe we can pop over there and take a peek at what you've got going.
Yeah, so we're gonna switch to magic.
Yeah, let's do it in the last few minutes here. I think we could. We do have about 5 minutes, 5 straight minutes, but yeah.
Okay. Last thing I was just gonna say with skin is I think I've gone a little too monochromatic, so you can always use something like a color layer and
Hmm.
saturate the skin more in different areas, and that's kind of what I'm doing here. But we can
Nice.
hop on over, talk a little bit more about magic. So,
Yes.
magic and liquid. I was just gonna say the thing about liquid is, and stop me at any point, Val, if I'm going on too long, but I was going to say a lot of water or liquid, if you look at it, it's really just these areas of shadow and translucency.
Hmm.
Translucency, where the light's passing through, you can see on this wave, the skylight's coming through it, but there's some deep shadows too. So kind of finding where those things are is really going to help with that. But for liquid and magic, really what I was going to say is my technique for it is just the hard round brush. This is kind of the method of painting I was talking about before,
Hmm.
where I like to block in my colors. So let's say I'm doing some sort of water. I might do something like this, where I get my deep shadows. I'm going to maybe make those like more blue and purple. I go a little bit lighter. Um, and, I'll try to find my brighter points. We can even get a little bit of green in there, kind of that surf color. And when I'm doing that, a lot of times I'll just smudge around and I'll be kind of organic with it. And
Nice.
I'll just modify, like, okay, I want a little bit more translucency here, so I'll add in a little bit of a little more of a highlight. Okay, maybe I want to go more towards white even because it's even brighter. So I would study the liquid and kind of see how it goes, but this is the method and the technique. Like knowing where to put the values is the big trick,
Hmm.
but this is how I put them down. And finding out like how hard do you want your edges to be. You can sharpen things up in some areas if you need to, but a lot of times, water might have this kind of, if you have splash going on, it might have this sort of hard edge.
Yeah.
You just want to get that area of highlight, and then those areas of shadow and kind of the edge that you want. So I can paint magic this way, or I can paint liquid this way. But if we have a minute, I could show my sort of gradient map technique for magic if we have
Yeah,
enough time.
absolutely. We've got about 2.5 minutes before we would have to sign off. So if you think you can pull it up in that time, go for it.
All right, stop me if I go over, but I'll do it real quick. So you
Okay.
make a screen layer and you fill it in with black. So I just need to make that screen mode, and I'm going to choose black, fill it in, and then I make a painting layer. It's just a normal layer. I call it paint.
Hmm.
And then we make a gradient map. Now we take the gradient map and the paint layer and clip it to the black screen layer. And from here, what I do is I choose a gradient that has to start with black. That's a key. I also have a video about this on my Instagram Reels if anyone's curious,
Yeah.
since we're short on time. But essentially, you go to that paint layer, you just choose white, and then the values of the white when you smudge it correspond with the values in the gradient map. So as I smudge it, it's making them a little bit darker than white, and I can go back in and paint the bright points and smudge that some more, and you can smudge it a lot to make it really wispy. You can make like really thin little marks if you want to kind of have this like electricity type effect. But it's
Yeah.
basically just painting and smudging, and having fun with that. And the cool thing is when you're done, you
We
can
got
change the
about
gradient map.
just a few moments before we need to go back to our main cam, but just
Okay,
giving you, yeah.
so this is it, and then you can change the gradient map, and you can change the effect even after you've done it. So it's a lot of fun.
Yeah,
But that's
that's
how I paint
amazing.
magic. A lot of
Um,
smudging.
I see what you meant about like really applying it to a lot of the magical type stuff, and I love it. I kind of approach, like you said, with a lot of the darker values and kind of playing with those darker and lighter points until something starts to look like really translucent and magical in a way. We are out of time though. I wish I had more time to kind of dig into it. But Sam, it's been an absolute blast like hanging out with you today. Man, I really feel genuinely like I learned a lot watching you work and listening to you talk about your approach to a lot of these materials. And I think that everybody in chat would agree. It was really cool to have you here, so thank you very much. And we will get some links for Sam in the chat if you guys would like to follow him. If you're not following him already, he did mention that he has some pretty cool stuff up on his Instagram if you want to check out some more in-depth tutorials from him. But that is all the time we have for today, folks. So we're going to take off. You ready to go, Sam?
I'm all ready. Thanks for having me, Val.
No problem. It was a pleasure. We'll see you guys another time. Adios, everybody.
Bye. Thanks for joining.